All right, so here's our final video for the week. So we've talked about these new states. A lot of the conversation in this chapter are non-state actors' responses to the structures they exist within. Um, so that's kind of like the gist of what this chapter kind of focuses on. But just in general, I kind of argue that this is kind of a incoherent chapter, an incoherent part of the unit. Probably because it has to cover so much. I feel like a causes, methods, and effects structure would have been a lot easier for them to have this make sense to you guys. So please ask your teachers to clarify stuff throughout this unit. So here is our first page of vocab. We have one more after this one. Okay. All right. So there are some extraordinary practices that occur in certain independence movements, certain political movements throughout the 20th century. Something that is remarkable is the effectiveness of nonviolence in certain situations. So the examples that they give us in AMSCO are Gandhi, MLK, and Nelson Mandela. So Gandhi, which we've learned about in 7.5. So go back to your notes to review kind of like Satyagraha, the Salt March, things like that. I'm pretty sure I talked about that. Gandhi, his decision to use nonviolence was immensely popular with the people of India. So not only is things like Satyagraha steeped in Hindu traditions of nonviolence, but also it's something that like people can't really find morally objectionable. And so, especially in the global community, the visibility of the Indian independence movement is enhanced by its commitment to nonviolence. Now, here's a really important caveat. Violence was still a part of the independence movement. The stuff we've talked about so far in these 3 chapters have talked a lot about violence in India. And arguably, it's the uptick in communalistic violence that really accelerated India's path to independence because the British were like, we are washing our hands of this. This is too much. But figures like Gandhi really had an immense amount of influence among the Indian population. In a book I'm just finishing up now, in kind of the peak moment of partition violence, where Hindus and Muslims are just killing each other like unabatedly, Gandhi goes on a hunger strike. That says like, if you guys cannot get along, I will not eat until you guys get along. And throughout India, the violence stops within 3 days. Gandhi does not eat for 4 days or 5 days. But like that's the influence Gandhi had. Like that's like really hard to think about. Like India is a country at that time of 300, 400 million people, and this one man decided to say like, I'm not going to eat until you guys stop killing each other, and then they stopped killing each other for a few days. It did cool off. I'm not joking. It did cool off. Like the Kashmir stuff didn't finish up, but the communalistic violence stopped as a result of Gandhi's hunger strike. Another person you're probably familiar with who used nonviolence was Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader of one group in the civil rights movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who actually directly took the tactics of Gandhi and Satyagraha, and ultimately, through using boycotts and also challenging segregation in the courts. Now, it's a decolonial movement because it's challenging established power structures like European or white supremacy, but it's not like independent. It's not black nationalism. And it's effective in several respects. Mainly, MLK's policies are more attractive to white moderates than, say, the aggressive rhetoric of leaders like Malcolm X. So, but I don't want you guys to have any illusions. before MLK was assassinated, his polling rate was like at 33%. Like 33% of Americans approved of what MLK was doing. So it wasn't like he was this unifying figure, but he controlled the conversation in a lot of ways that made the requests of African Americans, specifically in challenging de jure segregation in the South, palatable to white moderates. Also, the thing about nonviolence is when you pursue it, and the people who you are in conflict with choose to use violence, the optics of that are terrible. Think about like the images you have of the American Civil Rights Movement. You have things like the Children's March, where during the Birmingham campaign, the LCLC uses children to kind of march for rights because so many adults are in prison, and the police of Birmingham, the city of Birmingham, use dogs and fire hoses on these kids, and that's on television. And everyone's like, "What are you doing, Birmingham? You're barbarians." And that really challenged a lot of that put pressure on the Birmingham municipality to change their segregationist policies as well. Finally, we have Nelson Mandela, who, when he was younger, tried a little bit of violence, and that did not work. So after he was freed from prison in the late 1980s, he pursues a strategy of nonviolence and effectively appeals to the global community to challenge the apartheid government. And I don't know if we talk about the rest of apartheid in the rest of this book. I don't think we do. We might have it in a chapter earlier or later, but apartheid essentially was like American segregation towards Black people on steroids, because in America, people of African descent are a minority. In South Africa, people of African descent are a substantial majority in South Africa, and they were like totally like put on. It was kind of like how America has treated Black people and Native Americans put together. Like they put them on reservations. They were only allowed to leave those reservations if they had certain permissions, things like that. And Mandela was able to use nonviolence to highlight the injustice of that system, and eventually a global campaign to boycott South African goods put a lot of pressure on South Africa to end apartheid, and they do. And Nelson Mandela is the first elected Black president of South Africa, and things like that. Like for example, like in the 1980s, it was very popular to like boycott diamonds because they all came from South Africa, that they were part of the De Beers mining company and things like that. All right. It's like we moved into the 90s, going back to the 50s and 60s. In the Soviet system, there were the nations that tried to challenge supremacy of the Soviet Union in the Eastern Bloc, not like to overcome the Soviet Union, but to assert their own autonomy within the Eastern Bloc. So that I know it's easy for us to think about like all these countries are just like puppets of the Soviet Union. But it's important to note that had to be imposed on them, that many of these countries did not welcome that action. So Poland is a country that's occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. And a leader, Gomulka, is able to maintain a degree of domestic autonomy in Poland, but he only does that by pretty much sacrificing foreign control of the country. Like, so the foreign policy of the country was dictated by the Soviet Union, not by Poland. And as a result of that, Poland could exercise more domestic autonomy. In Hungary, in Hungary, there was a far more noted resistance of communism led by a man named Imre Nagy. And the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 is violently put down by the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia also tries to expand the freedoms of Czechoslovakians, but in the end, that's also put down by the Soviet Union as well, and the Warsaw Pact nations. So the kind of theme is that nations try to challenge the power of the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s, but they're ineffective at doing so. All right. 2 more slides, I think. So a theme to really focus on is that the methods that were used in the 20th century to challenge these established power structures existed in the past. So, like, for example, our DBQ you guys did about Australia, New Zealand, and then Indigenous people. we have an example of non-violence being used by Maori people in that DBQ. So this is not unique to the 20th century. The scale, though, is. And in a democratic society, protest is one of the key ways that the population can hold the government accountable outside of elections. And since a lot of governments just can't have elections whenever they want, protest is a key way democracies can function, or states can function, or respond, know what the people want them to do, right? Even if they don't want to know, even if they don't want to do it, protest coerce the government into action is what I'm trying to get at. So a characteristic of the 20th century and the 21st century even, are the size of protests. How, especially after World War II, these are massive, massive movements of people. Think about the protests over the summer, the millions of people across this country who protested the actions of the police after in the response to George Floyd's death. Throughout and examples they use in 1968 specifically would be in France, the largest general strike in history, which means that across the country, 10 million people stopped going to their jobs, which puts immense strain on a country's economy. If something like 30-40% of your working population stops working, you're going to find a way to get them back to work, because you can't force 10 million people to go back to work. You don't have enough police officers, right? So the general strike is immensely impactful on France. I'm pretty sure it's a response to Charles de Gaulle not giving up power soon enough, because this is like 4 years after the Algerian Wars ended. In Vietnam, we have protests across the country. 68, if you have a relative, a grandparent who's alive during 1968, ask them what they think about 1968, because it was a busy year. There were protests everywhere. The anti-war movement was at its peak. MLK was assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. There's a lot of instability in the country at the time. And what the EMSCO makes specific note of is the Kent State Massacre, where 4 American citizens were killed by the police during a protest of the war in Vietnam. Okay, I think that's our last one. Oh no, we have one more. This is a dense slide, it looks like, right? So we've talked about nonviolence significantly. We're now going to talk about terrorism, used by groups to try and impose their will. And the theme of these points focus on actually the relative inefficiency of violence in having these groups achieve their goals. Mainly because violence is polarizing. And so if you're trying to impose an action or policy, forcing a group to adopt that policy under threat of violence typically builds animosity between the two groups. Now, if your goal is to increase polarization, then that's a great tactic, which we'll talk about an example of that near the end of this. If you're trying to do something else, it's not going to be that effective. So, for example, Northern Ireland is the part of Ireland that's still a part of the United Kingdom today. As a result of British colonialism throughout the years 1000 to 2000, the Northern Ireland, which is also called Ulster, is majority Protestant because of the cultural diffusion that occurs between British and Northern Ireland. But there is a Catholic minority in Northern Ireland, and these groups think that all of Ireland should be unified. And also, there are sympathetic groups within the country of Ireland that support this. So the group that was the most significant in that was the Irish Republican Army. And they used terrorism, and the idea of it would be to make the British presence in Northern Ireland so inconvenient, the British would be forced to withdraw from Northern Ireland. However, since there's a significant Protestant population in Northern Ireland, the pressure that the British government felt was never significant enough for them to leave Northern Ireland. So the IRA's campaign of terrorism was ultimately inefficient. The next example of this would be Basques in Spain. Basques are the only non-Indo-European language group on the continent of Europe. Like somehow when the Romans spread and the Romans spread Latin and stuff around the continent, they missed this territory, and this Basque culture group is very different than the rest of Spain. But it's also a significant minority, a substantial minority. So even though the ETA uses terrorism to try and give the Basques their own country, Spain's like, this doesn't hurt us enough to warrant us doing that. And so the Basque violence doesn't leave the impact that was needed to change Spain's policy. In Peru, you have the group called the Shining Path. They're communist in the vein of like Mao and the Khmer Rouge, which I talked about, last chapter. They want to impose communism throughout Peru. Again, the policy is not popular enough, and so eventually they're not effective at getting communism imposed. They have to change the policy, and so the Shining Path now I think operates as a quasi-political party within Peru, but still does not garner a great deal of national support. Now, possibly the group that has used terrorism the most effectively are fundamentalist Muslims. So fundamentalist Muslims kind of come from the same vein of pan-Arabism or pan-Africanism, that these groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS are interested in removing foreign, specifically Western influence from their territory. Because you also have fundamentalist Muslim groups like Al-Qaeda in Mali and ISIS in Mali and things like that. So it's not just like in the Middle East, or it's not just in the Arabic-speaking world, but these groups have a message that Western culture, American culture, European culture is bad, is preying on the Muslim world, and we should remove that influence. And their use of terrorism has been to target either symbols within their own countries or symbols within these Western countries of that imperialism, of that foreign influence. And ultimately, the reason why this has worked so effectively is that the Western response to fundamentalist Islamic terrorism has been to further increase their involvement in the Middle East, that has polarized the Muslim populations of many of these countries against Western influence. So even though, but that's not to say that like all these Muslim countries now are like anti-American. If you ever talk to someone from those countries, you say like, well, we don't like what America does. We also don't like what fundamentalist Muslims do either. So not everyone fits in with this group. But so for an examples of territories where there's increased instability, like Syria, because it's fighting a civil war now for almost a decade, disenfranchised groups, populations, find the messaging of fundamentalist Islam far more attractive. So that's where they grow. So in places like Iraq that have been endemically unstable for the past 20 years, or Syria that have been unstable for the past decade, these messages are far more attractive because these fundamentalists, in the same way that Hitler gave an easy target for the Germans, fundamentalists blame the situation these peoples live in a fascistic sense, that it's America's fault that you're like this, and we should punish America and America's allies for that reason. That's kind of interesting, right? And America even has its own example of terrorism. So examples of this could be in the 1995, we had the Oklahoma City bombing where a white nationalist made a bomb in a car, blew up the car, killed 138 people in a federal building in a way he tried to induce a race war with that attack. Like he believed that by destroying this federal building, the white people of America would rise up, eradicate the racial minorities of this country, and lead to a white state. The Charleston church bombing. I mean, I think you wanted to use these two events as examples of what terrorism could be, right? Because we think of terrorism as 9/11, where 9/11 is like, the biggest example of terrorism in human history because so many people died on 9/11. in the Charleston church bombing, where a white nationalist walked into a church meeting where that was a church that was predominantly African American and executed 8 parishioners at a prayer meeting, I believe. That's also terrorism, because he was doing this because he was a white nationalist. That kind of terrorism occurs all over the world as well. That fundamentalist Muslims use that kind of rationale, use those kind of actions as well, targeting people who they believe to be unpure Muslims and things like that. Throughout the 21st century, we have examples and fears of homegrown terrorism. The two main groups that we're afraid of are or have experienced degrees of terrorism would be white nationalism and also fundamentalist Muslims. Those have been the two larger groups. There's kind of a commonality among them. Largely, these people are radicalized on the internet. A white nationalist might be radicalized on Parler, where a Muslim, this is even before, like, you could watch, like, videos from Osama bin Laden on the internet, or you could watch beheadings done by ISIS fighters in Syria online and get radicalized. That the internet has, I don't know if I'm going this right now. The internet is responsible for the radicalization of populations because you can curate your social network, because you can choose who you interact with on the internet. You're not forced to interact with anyone you don't want to interact with. You can choose to segregate yourself into a hyper-specific population, which can make you far more susceptible to radical positions, right? Because if you only want to talk to white nationalists, you only have to talk to white nationalists. If you only want to talk to fundamentalist Muslims, you only have to talk to fundamentalist Muslims. You don't have to talk to anyone who's like, those ideas are crazy, man. You don't ever have to hear that on the internet. So, yeah. So, final chapter, please. We have too much. Final section. There are militarized states that try to assert control over the populations. Spain tries to assert control and does so effectively. Franco stays in power after the Spanish Civil War and dies in the 1970s. Then Spain transitions to a democracy. An example of a militarized state where, like, the military is in control but not effectively is Idi Amin in Uganda. He is a military dictatorship. He is not consistent in a lot of ways. He commits domestic cleansing. He does some human rights abuses. He agitates against his neighbors. Tanzania has enough of that. They invade Uganda. They install a democracy, and that's like fine and chill. And finally, another fear that comes out of this stuff is the military-industrial complex. That a consequence of nuclear, or the growth of nuclear weapons, is that countries are less willing to engage in massive scale wars, but do fight small scale wars significantly more. So we've had, as a result of all these new nations coming to power and the instability of these nations coming to power and disruption of all that stuff, has led to conflicts across the world at a far higher rate than historically true. Which means that the military industry has led to gain via a perpetual state of conflict. And if a nation's economy becomes dependent on its military industry, it becomes incentivized to sow conflict wherever it is, or use military forces to resolve conflicts because they benefit economically from doing so. And so that's what Amsco wants to know about the military-industrial complex. Well, these were long videos. Thank you guys for listening today. I'll see some of you guys in Zoom.